Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here to do the Freudian Book Tag. This tag was originally created by Hierarchy of Reads, and I was tagged by the wonderful Todd from Todd the Librarian. I will of course link both of them down below. Also, my extensive apologies if Hierarchy of Reads ever comes across this video, because I am really not a big fan of Freud, but I did enjoy the questions. I thought they were really creative and interesting, so I hope it's okay that I'm doing the tag anyway. I'm sorry. Number 1. Freud's theories are commonly mischaracterized and underappreciated. Name a character in a book that you feel is misunderstood. In what ways? My girl, Laura Jean from the Laura Jean trilogy by Jenny Han. I cannot tell you how many reviews I've seen of this book where people complain about how annoying and immature and like dumb Laura Jean is. And for one thing, I really just enjoy her as a character. I really like her. And for another, I actually really identify with her. I feel like there's some big differences, of course, but I feel like I really connected with I don't know, her mindset when she was a teenager. Like, she's like 16 or something in these books. Like, she's not gonna have the emotional maturity of like a 22-year-old, you know? Like, that's just not what's gonna happen. And I just really enjoyed reading a book about a character who felt like me when I was younger, who had some of the same insecurities and the same kind of mindset and the same things that were important to them. And I really enjoyed her, and I really connect with her, and I will defend her until the end of time, because I think it's important that we have like various kinds of teenagers to connect to, and it doesn't matter how old you are. Sometimes it's still nice to read a book where like you feel seen, your past self feels seen. Number 2. When Freud first debuted his psychoanalytic theory, it was not well received. Many were scandalized by his discovery of children's sexuality. It was only later that his work was recognized and applauded. What is a book whose debut was not well received, or a book whose release was considered by some to be scandalous? What were your thoughts? See, this is one of my issues with Freud, but we're not going to talk about that now. I'm actually going with a play, and that is A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen. When this play premiered, it was shocking, it was scandalous, it was just people were not into it, and it's considered a masterpiece now. Like, it's considered one of the greatest modern plays, and I think for good reason. I think it's incredibly feminist and incredibly well written and well put together, and I actually think there are some aspects about the ending that even today would maybe surprise people if they were enacted in the exact same way as when the play first premiered. And I'm being kind of vague because if you have not read or seen this play before, I really don't want to spoil it for you, because there is something that I think you get out of it if you don't know what's coming. Number 3. Freud is said to have been very self-aware and self-analyzing even in childhood. What is a book that seems to have been quite aware of itself? What kind of reading experience did this make for you? I'm going with the Chronicles of Narnia series by C.S. Lewis. This is one of my favorite series, and it's definitely like the narration style is very self-aware. I remember when my sister was reading the books for the first time, she was really enjoying them, and she told me that like the narrator, it's like the book knows it's a book. And that was really weird. She'd never come across something like that. It's kind of like breaking the fourth wall, but in a very particular way. And I really enjoyed it. I think it really added to my reading experience, because it really added to this feeling of, like, it was just very, like, charming, but I don't mean that in a condescending way. Like, I just think it really fit the tone and the style of the books. Number 4. While many aspects of Freud's theories are still used, he was very much a product of his time. For instance, in his early career, he was influenced by Darwinism, and in later years by the discoveries made by physicists. Being a neurologist, most of his early discoveries were influenced by medicine and biology. Name a book that was strongly influenced by prominent ideas of the time, but that have remained relevant over time. Why do you think it's maintained its relevance? And I'm going with another play, and that is an ancient one this time, and that is Lysistrata by Aristophanes. Now, I'm actually doing something a little bit differently, because this play was definitely very influenced by the Peloponnesian War, which was going on around this time, but it was also influenced by ancient ideas of gender and sexuality that are actually very different today. So if you don't know, the main storyline of Lysistrata is that all of the women in Athens decide that they are sick of this whole Peloponnesian War thing. They decided that they're not going to have sex with their husbands until the war ends. Basically, they're going on a sex strike. And the reason this was a comedy in Aristophanes' day is because women were considered to be the very like the promiscuous and the very like sex-obsessed sex or gender. And so that's where the comedy came from, is because everyone's like, oh, women aren't going to be able to do this. Like, there's no way they'll be able to refrain from sex in order to get what they want. And of course, nowadays, the stereotype is kind of the opposite, you know, we consider men to be the ones that are very focused on sex, and it's just really interesting seeing how that has shifted, and it's really interesting that that play has lasted in relevance to today, because for one thing, of its anti-war message, I think that's something that can be very topical at various times and places in history, but I also think it's interesting that it's become so, like, it's become this, like, feminist play, like, people interpret it as being very feminist, and I think that's really interesting, because I don't necessarily think that's what Aristophanes had intended, but I kind of like that it's remained relevant in a way that's very different from its original intention. I definitely don't think you should go into this play thinking it's going to be like a proto-feminist work, because it's definitely not, but despite all of its issues, I do think it's worth reading or seeing, and it's got some interesting things to discuss. Number 5, the unconscious. Freud was the first to suggest that all behavior is the result of hidden mental states, or as he called it, the unconscious. Name a book that, in your opinion, shows the real side of humanity or a character. And I'm going to go with The Dollmaker of Krakow by R.M. Romero. Now, I think in a lot of World War II stories, or stories that are set in similar times of like suffering and upheaval, I think you can make the argument that they show kind of the two sides of humanity, you know? It's like people can do really good things in times of great trouble, and people can do really awful things. And I think that that's also true in this book. But another reason I specifically chose this book is because there's this really great emphasis on people's decisions and how they choose their own path. Like, you might have certain circumstances, but it's ultimately up to you what you do with them. And that's not to say that people can't be affected by their past, but at a certain point you do have personal responsibility. And there's one character in particular who there's sort of parallels drawn between him, and he's a very bad character. There are parallels drawn between him and one of the main characters who's a very good person. And there's this comparison about how they could have kind of ended up in the same place because of how similar their circumstances were, but then there's like this explicit conclusion drawn that's like, but that isn't what happened. He chose to become a bad person. He chose to become a Nazi and to do these terrible things. Well, this other person did not. And I think that's really, really important to have that distinction made. You know, it's like, you are what you make of yourself, and yes, your background, your influences can affect that, but that's not enough to excuse what you do. Number 6, instincts. One of the basic premises of psychoanalysis is that human mind and behavior are influenced by unconscious drives, libido and aggression, sexual or love versus destruction or death. What is a book that deals with these primal forces? I'm going with Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is a really great urban fantasy vampire noir kind of book that is set in Mexico City, and I really, really enjoyed it. It's a very intense book, and a lot of it does deal with like survival and like aggression and things like that. And also, one of the villain characters, he does have kind of this sexual dimension to the reason that he is pursuing the main female character. And I didn't enjoy that aspect so much because I think I didn't see it as being necessary, because we were already convinced that he was a bad guy. I don't think we needed the threat that he was going to rape her in order to be afraid for what was going to happen to her. But kind of after finishing it, I do see what the author was doing, and I understand it a little bit more, and I do recommend that book overall. It's really fantastic, and I'm excited to continue reading more from Silvia Moreno Garcia. Number 7, hysteria and repression. At the turn of the century, Freud claimed that people were so sexually repressed that they started to develop physiological symptoms, such as blindness, numbness, hysterical attacks, when in fact nothing was physically wrong with them. Name a book that features repressed sexuality. So here's another of my issues with Freud, and I do like that the question like called him out and was like, that's actually not what was happening. But I actually, in stories, I am not a fan of the sexual repression as a motivator thing. I don't find it convincing. I don't find it interesting. I know that in real life that can be a motivator for people, but I think in most cases, like, it's one of many reasons for somebody making a particular choice or committing a crime or like various things like that. I think in general it's more complex than that. And the book that I chose is The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. So I did not love this book like a lot of people did, and one of the reasons actually is because of the author's use of that trope or that motivator. There's one character in here whose like entire motivation and existence is like based on sexual repression, and like I just personally find that really boring to read about and really just unconvincing. Like, that's literally their only motivation is, I didn't have sex and now I'm messed up. Like, that doesn't, to me, that doesn't create an interesting or well-developed character. And I know that some of that is down to personal preference, but I just think overall, like wanting to fuck someone does not a complete character make. I think it's lazy is what it comes down to. And this book is by no means the only one that does this or like the worst offender. This is just kind of a good example of what I don't enjoy about it. I just find it really lazy, and I also feel like it implicitly excuses awful behavior, because there's this idea that like, oh, well, if you hadn't been sexually repressed, you wouldn't have done this thing. And I'm like, no, you're still responsible for your actions. Like, this idea that if like this character had just gotten laid, like everything, like this wouldn't have happened, everything would have been fine. To me, that smacks of not holding them responsible. And I'm just not down for that. That sounds very similar to the incel / nice guy trope / meninist movement. Like, all of that seems very similar to kind of the underlying implications of this, and I'm just not a fan of how it's handled. Number 8, dreams. In his groundbreaking interpretation of dreams, Freud discovered that dream analysis is one of the best ways to understand the unconscious. This practice is still one of the key skills that modern psychoanalysts today have to learn how to master. Name a book where dreams are heavily prominent. So I really like this question because like weird dream world is kind of one of my bookish buzzwords. I did like a whole recommendations video on it, and I'm gonna mention one that I did mention in that just because I love it so much and I feel like it's really underhyped, and that is Sing Sweet Nightingale by Erica Cameron. This is such a dark and strange story. It's about a girl who she has this like relationship with a person in her dreams, and as the reader, we know there's something weird about this, and I think that this book actually has a really powerful depiction of an emotionally abusive relationship, like a very controlling relationship, so there's definitely a content warning for that, but I just think this was done so well. Like, the world building was really excellent, the characters and the character development was so amazing. Number 9, the couch. Of course, how can we forget the couch? Lying down to talk about anything at all while a stranger sits behind you is a weird dynamic, however fascinating and effective. There's something unique and special about the analyst-patient relationship, something you can only know if you have experienced it. Name a book with interesting, weird, and or unique relationships. And I chose Deathless by Catherine M. Valente. This is such a weird, dark, twisted book, and the relationships are also very weird and dark and twisted, especially the one between Koshi the Deathless and the main character, Maria. It's so messed up, but there's a part of you that like still likes seeing them together because they're very well matched. And I mentioned, like pretty much every time I talk about this book, I mention how the relationship is definitely not like a healthy one necessarily, but I wouldn't necessarily call it abusive either, just because the unequal power dynamics that are always present in abusive relationships, like that doesn't really happen here because the balance of power shifts between the two of them back and forth so many times. Like, it doesn't really feel like one of them is controlling the other. Like, there was a part at the beginning of this book where I'm like, I am not on board for this. This is so messed up. This is really uncomfortable. And even though it is still uncomfortable, when you go through the book, it's like you realize that it's very balanced as far as like who has more power in the relationship, because that's always shifting, and because it's always shifting, it doesn't feel like one of them is abusive and the other one is the abused, if that makes sense at all. But again, this book is definitely not for everyone. I definitely don't recommend this couple as like relationship goals or anything. I'm just saying like it really fits the question, because so many of these relationships, and especially the main romantic relationship, is like, ooh, what is this? But I kind of like it. And finally, number 10 is Freud has been seriously misunderstood by many since his day. Be that as it may, modern research has supported many of his findings. Today, psychoanalysis is a strong field with more and more people training to become analysts. Name a book or author that makes you hopeful about the future. I'm going with Wild Beauty by Anna Marie McLemore. This is one of my favorite books of last year, and it was a huge surprise because I did not think it was something I would be super interested in, but I absolutely adored this. And the reason this book gives me hope for the future, that it's a very hopeful book for me, is that it's a book all about healing and grief and togetherness and friendship and sisterhood. Like, it's not a light and sweet and fluffy book. I don't think it's hopeful in that way. It's hopeful in the way that there are bad things that happen that they move past, and it really is just a book about healing, I think, over anything else, really. And it's just such a gorgeous book. I understand why it's not for everyone, but this is like one of the books of my soul, and I love it so much. Okay, everybody, so that was the Freudian Book Tag. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!